She had only $4, a secondhand dress, and a dream of being seen. At one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, a 17-year-old black girl sits alone, waiting for a date that will never come. But someone else is watching. What begins as humiliation will turn into something much deeper, a story of pride, class, and quiet strength that no money can buy. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets of Louisville into ribbons of silver that reflected the glare of streetlights. It was the kind of southern storm that came down in sheets, hammering the rooftops, drumming on windshields, swallowing the sound of engines and footsteps alike. Ethan Carter squinted through his wipers as they fought to keep up, the rhythmic swish the only steady thing in a night that felt swallowed by chaos. His hands were cracked from years of oil and grease, and they tightened on the steering wheel as thunder rolled somewhere above the Ohio River. He was bone-tired, the kind of tired that crawls under the skin and settles behind the eyes. He just finished a 12-hour shift at the auto shop, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz like angry bees and the smell of gasoline clung to you long after you'd gone home. Home. The word was more of a habit than a comfort these days. He had a small house on the east side, 2 bedrooms, a front porch he never used, and silence so thick it sometimes woke him at night. His daughter Lily was 8 now, tucked in bed at the neighbor's house, probably asleep with a book on her chest. That thought usually brought him a flicker of warmth, but tonight the exhaustion ran deeper than usual. The rain made everything feel heavier. He told himself he'd just get home, dry off, check on Lily, maybe heat up leftovers, and collapse. That was the rhythm his life had taken since his wife died 3 years ago, a quiet march from one weary day to the next. He didn't think much about the future anymore. It was easier not to. When the headlights cut across the next intersection, he almost missed them, a small shape huddled under the bus shelter, barely visible through the downpour. At first, he thought it was trash blown against the bench, maybe a blanket, until movement caught his eye. 2 figures, a woman and a child, pressed together against the cold, drenched to the bone. He drove past another 100 feet before his foot hit the brake without his mind catching up. He cursed softly, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. Maybe it was the memory of another night like this, years ago, when he'd driven to the hospital too late. Maybe it was the sight of that small body curled against the woman's chest, her arms forming a fragile shield against the rain. Whatever it was, he reversed slowly, pulling up to the shelter. When he stepped out of the truck, the rain hit him like a wall. Within seconds, his jacket was soaked through, cold biting at his neck. The woman looked up, startled, her face half hidden beneath a wet hood. She was young, maybe 30, her dark brown skin glistening with rain, her eyes wide and wary. The child 4, maybe 5, was clinging to her, coughing softly, his breath shallow. "You all right?" Ethan had to raise his voice over the storm. The words sounded clumsy, useless. She hesitated, glancing down the empty street. "We're fine," she said, but the way her voice cracked made it sound like a lie even she didn't believe. Ethan looked at the little boy who was shaking, his lips tinged blue. "He doesn't look fine. You can't stay out here in this weather." The woman shifted her weight, pulling the child closer. "The bus didn't come. I thought maybe—" She stopped, her throat tightening. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered finally. Ethan felt something stir inside his chest, a dull ache that wasn't entirely his own. He knew that look, he'd seen it in the mirror too many times. That mix of pride and despair, the kind that comes from fighting too long without winning. "Come on," he said quietly. "I've got a dry truck and a heater that still works. Let's get you both out of this rain." She hesitated again, eyes darting to his face, searching for danger. He didn't blame her. A stranger in the middle of the night was no small risk. But the wind howled around them, and when lightning cracked across the sky, the boy flinched hard enough that she finally nodded. Ethan opened the passenger door and helped them inside. The cab filled with the smell of rain and damp fabric. The boy leaned against his mother, still trembling. She murmured something to him, soft, soothing, and Ethan turned up the heat until the vents hissed warm air. "I'm Ethan," he said after a while, trying to sound steady. She glanced at him, still wary. Tanya Reed. This is Malik." "Nice to meet you both," he said. "Wish it were under better circumstances." They didn't talk much on the drive. The roads were nearly empty, the city wrapped in rain. Ethan's headlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the dark. Every so often he glanced at Tanya. She was staring out the window, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes hollow in the dashboard glow. She looked like someone who'd run out of options. By the time they reached his neighborhood, the rain had softened to a mist. Ethan pulled into his driveway, the small house standing silent behind a sagging maple tree. The porch light flickered, casting shadows across the wet steps. He killed the engine and turned to her. "It's not much," he said, "but it's dry and safe. You can stay tonight at least." "I don't want to intrude," she murmured. "You're not," he said simply. "Come on, let's get Malik warm." Inside, the house was dim, but it smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. Ethan flipped on a lamp, revealing a worn couch, scattered tools on the counter, and a photo of a smiling woman with Lily perched on her lap. Tanya's eyes lingered on it for a moment before she looked away. Ethan gestured toward the hallway. "Bathroom's down there. There's towels in the cabinet. I'll grab some dry clothes." When he came back, she was standing in the doorway, holding Malik, who was already half asleep. "You can lay him down in Lily's room for now," Ethan said softly. "She's spending the night next door. It's warm." Tanya hesitated but followed him down the hall. She tucked Malik into bed, her hands trembling as she brushed damp curls from his forehead. He let out a sigh, the kind children make when they finally feel safe. She stood there for a long time, watching him breathe. When she came back to the kitchen, Ethan was pouring hot water into 2 mugs. "Chamomile," he said. "Best I could do." She took the cup, wrapping her fingers around it as though afraid it might disappear. For a while they just sat there in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the rain against the windows. Then quietly, as if confessing to the dark itself, Tanya began to talk. She told him about her job as a nurse in Memphis, about losing it when the hospital downsized, about her mother's passing and the bills that never stopped coming, about packing what little she had into her car and driving north, chasing a job lead that vanished as soon as she arrived, and finally about how the car broke down that morning, how she'd walked for hours with Malik in her arms, calling shelters that had no beds left. By the time she finished, her voice was shaking. Ethan didn't interrupt once. He just listened, his hands folded around his mug. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her eyes glistening. "I shouldn't be telling you all this. You don't even know me." He took a slow breath. "You're a mother trying to protect her son. That's all I need to know." Something in his tone, calm, certain, seemed to reach her. She nodded, staring down at her tea. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can stay here," he said after a long pause. "I've got a spare room. It's not fancy used to be my wife's office, but it's warm. You shouldn't have to be out there." Her eyes widened. "I couldn't. You've done enough." "It's not charity," Ethan said quietly. "It's what people should do." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm outside had calmed, replaced by the steady patter of rain. When Tanya finally met his gaze, there was a flicker of something new there. Fragile, almost invisible, but real. Trust. Later that night, when the house was dark and quiet, Ethan stood in Lily's doorway, watching Malik sleep. The boy's breathing was steady now, his small hands clutching the blanket. In the dim light, Ethan saw the outline of Tanya curled up in the armchair beside the bed, her head resting against the wall, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. He lingered for a moment, then turned away. Down the hall, he stopped at the photo of his wife. "You'd tell me I'm crazy," he murmured, "bringing strangers home in the middle of the night." He smiled faintly, a tired, broken smile. "But I couldn't drive past, not this time." When he finally crawled into bed, the house didn't feel as empty as it had the night before. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, and through the thin walls came the sound of breathing 2 strangers, asleep under his roof. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel like he was merely surviving. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for once the uncertainty didn't scare him. The storm had come, relentless and uninvited, yet somehow it had brought something with it, a spark, faint and flickering, but enough to remind him that even after the darkest nights, there could still be light. He closed his eyes, the rhythm of rain against the glass soft as a lullaby, and let himself drift into sleep, unaware that this one act of kindness, This one decision to stop on a rainy road would change everything. For him, for Tanya, for their children, and for the quiet, waiting house that was finally, once again, beginning to feel like home. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a mist that clung to the windows like breath on glass. The world outside Ethan Carter's house was washed clean, the pavement shining, the trees dripping quietly. Inside, the air was still and warm, carrying the faint scent of coffee and wet clothes drying by the vent. Ethan woke earlier than usual, though it took him a moment to remember why. Then he heard it, a soft cough from down the hallway, followed by the creak of floorboards. It wasn't Lily. For the first time in years, there were other sounds in his house. He sat on the edge of his bed, scrubbing a hand over his face. The memory of the night before came back in fragments. The storm, the shelter, the woman and her child, the way Tanya's voice trembled when she said she had nowhere to go. He had acted on instinct, not logic, the sort of decision that, once daylight came, always felt more complicated. He had no plan beyond that moment. What was he supposed to do now? Down the hall, faint movement stirred again. Ethan pulled on a shirt and stepped out of his room. The house looked different in the pale morning light, softer somehow. He found Tanya standing in the kitchen, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. The boy Malik sat at the table, legs swinging, holding a spoon that was far too big for his small hands. Someone had already started the coffee maker. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice rough with sleep. Tanya turned quickly, startled. "Oh, good morning. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he said. "Coffee's fair game." He gestured toward the pot. "Looks like you found everything." "I tried to make some for you," she said, almost apologetic. "You did so much last night. I didn't want to just sit here." Ethan poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching Malik. The boy had bright eyes, too big for his face, and he was studying the sugar bowl with intense concentration. "How's he doing?" Ethan asked. "Better," Tanya said softly. "He was wheezing a little when he woke up, but it's eased up. The inhaler helped." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for letting us stay. I know it's, unusual." Ethan shrugged, taking a sip. "So's finding a nurse and her kids sitting in the rain at midnight. Guess we're both a little unusual." The corner of her mouth lifted. "Guess so." Silence settled, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan realized it had been a long time since there'd been another adult in his kitchen who wasn't there to fix something or drop off mail. The sound of a child's spoon clinking against a bowl felt foreign yet oddly right. They ate together, though the meal was more an improvised mix of cereal, toast, and small talk. Tanya asked cautious questions about the neighborhood, about schools, about work. Ethan kept his answers simple. When he told her Lily was 8, Tanya's expression softened. "Malik's 5, she said. "He starts kindergarten next year, if—" She trailed off, the sentence collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. Ethan wanted to say something comforting, something that made sense, but words didn't come easy to him. Instead, he nodded toward the hallway. "You can stay as long as you need. We'll figure things out." Tanya looked up, her eyes shining just a little. "You don't even know us." "I didn't know the folks who helped me after my wife died either," he said quietly. "Didn't stop them." That silenced her. She looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with her finger. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. Some stories didn't need to be told all at once. When the knock came at the door, Ethan nearly spilled his coffee. It was Mrs. Landers, his neighbor, the one who'd watched Lily overnight. She was a retired teacher with kind eyes and a voice that always sounded slightly concerned. "Morning, Ethan," she said when he opened the door. "Lily's all ready to come home." Then she peered past his shoulder. "Oh, you have company." Ethan stepped aside. "This is Tanya and her son, Malik. They're staying for a little while." Mrs. Landers' eyes softened instantly. "Well, aren't you both lovely?" "Welcome, sweetheart," she said to Malik, who hid shyly behind Tanya's leg. "If you need anything at all, you just let me know." When she left, Lily came bounding inside, her hair tangled, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She stopped short when she saw Malik sitting at the table. "Who's that?" she asked, eyes wide. Ethan knelt down to her level. "This is Malik. He and his mom are going to stay here for a bit. They had some trouble last night, and we're helping them out." Lily studied the boy for a long moment, her expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. Then she grinned. "Want to see my Legos?" Malik blinked, then nodded slowly. The two of them disappeared down the hall, and within minutes the sound of laughter filled the house. A small, hesitant laughter at first, then louder, freer. Ethan caught Tanya watching them with a hand over her heart. "She's sweet," Tanya said. "She's strong," Ethan replied. "Got that from her mom." The day passed in small, ordinary moments. Ethan fixed the leaky faucet while Tanya folded the laundry he'd been ignoring for weeks. They traded polite conversation that occasionally dipped into real things. How long she'd been a nurse, what kind of cars he liked working on, how raising a kid alone sometimes felt like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. That night, after Malik had fallen asleep on the couch watching cartoons, Tanya sat by the window staring out at the streetlights. "It's strange," she said quietly, "being somewhere safe after so long." Ethan was sitting nearby, a mug of tea in his hands. "You get used to it," he said. "The quiet." "I don't think I ever will," she murmured. "When you're always moving, always worrying, quiet feels like waiting for something bad to happen." He understood that better than she knew. "Sometimes it's just quiet," he said. She turned toward him then, and for a brief second, their eyes met in a way that felt like recognition. Two people who'd lived through storms, finally finding shelter. Over the next few days, a fragile rhythm began to form. Ethan went to work early, leaving notes on the counter for Tanya. Simple things like, "Coffee's ready," or "Help yourself to cereal." Tanya took Malik and Lily to the park down the street, her laughter mingling with the children's voices. The neighbors started to wave more often when they passed. The house began to look lived in again. Ethan noticed it in small ways first. The kitchen smelled like food that wasn't canned soup. The radio played soft R&B in the evenings. The couch cushions were no longer perfectly aligned because the kids kept building forts out of them. When he came home from work, there was light in the windows. Not just the dull yellow glow of a lamp, but a real warmth, a life that had been missing for years. One evening as he stood in the doorway, watching Tanya help Malik with his inhaler, something inside him shifted. It wasn't attraction, not yet, not in the usual sense. It was recognition, a quiet knowing that this woman, this mother, understood things about pain and perseverance that most people couldn't. Later that night, he found Lily sitting on her bed, drawing. "You like having them here?" he asked. She nodded without looking up. "Yeah, Malik's funny. He doesn't talk much, but he makes faces." She paused, her pencil hovering. "It feels different now. The house, like it's not so sad." Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said softly. "I feel that too." He turned off her lamp and stood in the doorway for a while, watching her draw by the light from the hallway. In the next room, he could hear Malik breathing evenly, and somewhere down the hall, the soft creak of floorboards told him Tanya was still awake. He thought about the night he'd met her, the way she'd looked when she said she had nowhere to go, and how easily he could have kept driving. Weeks passed, and the arrangement that was supposed to be temporary began to stretch quietly into something more. Tanya started leaving small notes of her own lists of groceries, reminders about school forms, thank yous tucked beside his lunchbox. Ethan found himself smiling more at work, catching himself humming along to songs on the radio. The men at the shop noticed. "You look lighter, man," one of them said. "Somebody new in your life?" Ethan just shrugged, unwilling to put into words what he didn't fully understand yet. At home, the boundaries between guest and host blurred naturally. Tanya folded Lily's laundry along with her own. Ethan fixed Malik's toy truck without being asked. They talked in the evenings, sometimes about trivial things, sometimes about the heavy ones that crept in uninvited. One night after the kids were asleep, Tanya told him about her mother, how she'd worked double shifts her whole life, how she'd taught Tanya to be strong, but never how to rest. "I thought I was doing everything right," she said, "working hard, saving, being responsible, and still, one bad month and it all fell apart. I don't know how to start over." Ethan looked at her, the lamplight soft on her face. "You already did," he said. "You didn't quit. You kept Malik safe. That's starting over." She looked at him like she wanted to believe him. The days grew warmer, and by the end of the month, Louisville had settled into early summer. The air smelled of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. On Sundays, Ethan took the kids to the farmer's market, while Tanya cleaned the kitchen, humming under her breath. She'd begun leaving the windows open, letting in the sound of birds and laughter. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, times when they both remembered that this was temporary, that at some point Tanya would have to find a job, a place of her own. But for now, neither of them said it out loud. One evening, after tucking the children into bed, Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Tanya, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed him one and sat down beside him. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked after a while. He stared out at the fading light. "Used to," he said. "Not so much lately." "Why not?" "Because sometimes thinking too far ahead just ruins what's right in front of you." Tanya smiled faintly, looking down at her cup. "I guess I'm still learning that." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. Inside, the house glowed softly, a light in every room. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was becoming something else, something alive again. That night, as Ethan drifted to sleep, he thought of the first time he'd walked into the kitchen after his wife died, how the air had felt hollow, how even the walls had seemed to echo with absence. Now there was laughter again, warmth again, even music sometimes. He didn't know how long Tanya and Malik would stay, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what might change. The rain had brought them to his doorstep, and somehow that storm had left behind more than mud and memory. It had left light. And in that quiet house, under the slow hum of the ceiling fan, Ethan Carter finally dreamed of something he hadn't dared to in years. Not of loss, not of what was gone, but of what might still be found. Summer came slowly that year, stretching across Kentucky with heavy air and long evenings filled with the sound of cicadas. The rain that had once brought Tanya and Malik to Ethan's doorstep had become just a memory, the kind that slipped quietly into the background, leaving behind something new in its wake. The house had changed with the season windows open, curtains stirring with warm breezes, the smell of dinner lingering late into the night. What had started as an act of compassion had settled into routine, almost without notice. Ethan woke to the sound of laughter now, not silence. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with the ordinary rhythm of life. Every morning followed a kind of pattern. Ethan left early for the shop, the sun not yet high over the maple trees. Tanya was usually awake before him, dressed in scrubs she'd washed and ironed, even though she no longer had a hospital to go to. She packed lunches for the kids, made coffee, and reminded Ethan to eat something before he ran out the door. The first time she'd done that, he'd smiled and said she didn't have to. She'd smiled back and said she knew, then handed him a sandwich anyway. It had become their quiet ritual ever since. While Ethan worked, Tanya took Lily and Malik to the nearby elementary school playground. Lily was protective, guiding Malik by the hand, showing him where to climb and how to slide without scraping his knees. Parents sometimes asked if the two were siblings, and Tanya always smiled and said, "Something like that." It was easier than explaining the truth. The kids had become inseparable two halves of something that worked perfectly when together. In the afternoons, Tanya searched for work. She called clinics, hospitals, home health agencies. Some were polite but full, others were dismissive or skeptical. The gaps in her employment record spoke louder than her references. Still, she persisted. Every evening when Ethan came home, he would find her at the table with her laptop open and a stack of forms beside her. "Any luck?" he'd ask, setting down his tool bag. "Not yet," she would reply, sometimes smiling, sometimes not. But there was progress in other ways. The tension that had once filled her shoulders had eased. She laughed more now. Malik had color in his cheeks again, his cough almost gone. Ethan noticed these things in passing, without meaning to, like noticing sunlight through a window after months of gray. He told himself it was good to see them doing better, that helping them was enough. But sometimes when he came home to find Tanya humming softly while she cooked, he caught himself stopping in the doorway just to listen. One Friday evening, he arrived home later than usual. The sun was already low, and the air was thick with the smell of cut grass and charcoal from someone's grill down the street. He parked his truck and heard laughter coming from the backyard. When he stepped through the gate, he saw Tanya and the kids running through the sprinkler, barefoot on the lawn. Malik squealed as Lily chased him, both dripping wet. Tanya's hair clung to her neck, and her face was lit up with a smile Ethan hadn't seen before. A full, unguarded joy that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. When she finally noticed him, she stopped, brushing wet curls from her face. "You're home," she said, breathless. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. "Looks like I missed the fun." "Not too late," she replied, and before he could protest, Lily tossed him a soaked sponge from one of the buckets they'd been using. It hit him square in the chest. "You're on our team, Dad," she shouted. By the time the sun disappeared, all four of them were drenched and laughing so hard they could barely breathe. It was the kind of evening that etched itself quietly into memory, not for its excitement, but for its simplicity, for how alive it felt. Later, after the kids had gone inside, Tanya handed Ethan a towel and leaned against the porch railing beside him. They were both quiet, catching their breath. "You're good with them," she said eventually. He glanced at her. "You are too." She smiled faintly. "I used to think I had everything figured out. Work, Malik, life. But it turns out knowing how to survive isn't the same as knowing how to live." Ethan looked out at the yard, where droplets still clung to the grass. "Yeah," he said. "I learned that the hard way." They didn't say much more that night, but something had shifted, a small, unspoken understanding that the walls between them were starting to thin. The weeks that followed blurred together. The heat rose, and Tanya's job search stretched on. Some days she was hopeful, others frustration wore her down. One afternoon, Ethan came home to find her sitting on the porch steps, her head in her hands. Malik and Lily were drawing with chalk nearby, unaware. He set his bag down and sat beside her. "Bad day?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "The clinic interview I had, they filled the position before I even got there. They didn't bother to call. I thought I was doing something wrong, but maybe people just see someone like me and decide I'm not worth the trouble." He frowned. "Someone like you?" "A single mom, no savings, no stability, black woman from another state trying to start over." Her voice broke on the last words. "I thought I was tough, but I'm tired of fighting for every inch." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, staring out at the street. He knew that exhaustion. He'd felt it for years after his wife died, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes even breathing feel like work. Finally, he said, "You know what I see when I look at you? Someone who didn't give up. You could have stayed out there that night, but you didn't. You took care of your boy. You kept moving. That's not failure, Tanya. That's strength." She looked at him then, tears glistening in her eyes. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said, "but simple doesn't mean easy." A long silence followed, the kind that felt almost sacred. Then she nodded, wiping her cheeks. "Thanks, Ethan." He gave a small smile. "Anytime." 3 days later, everything changed. A message popped up on Tanya's phone while she was helping Lily with homework. It was from a clinic on the outskirts of the city, a small family practice that had seen her resume online. They wanted to meet her. Her hands trembled as she read it twice to be sure. When Ethan came home that evening, she was waiting by the door, eyes bright for the first time in weeks. "I got an interview," she said. "Tomorrow morning." He grinned, genuine and wide. "That's great, Tanya. You're going to nail it." She laughed, almost in disbelief. "I hope so. It feels like maybe things are finally turning." The next morning, Ethan watched her leave with Malik, wearing her best clothes, her shoulders squared with quiet determination. When she came back that afternoon, she was smiling so wide it startled him. "They offered me the job," she said, breathless. "It's not a hospital, but it's steady. Decent hours, good people." He wanted to say 100 things, how proud he was of her, how much she deserved it. But all he managed was a quiet, "That's amazing." That night over dinner, the kids chattered about their day, while Tanya and Ethan exchanged small, lingering glances across the table. For once, there wasn't a shadow hanging over them. The air felt lighter. As the weeks passed, Tanya settled into her new role at the clinic. She left early each morning, Malik in tow for daycare, and came home just after sunset. Ethan started adjusting his schedule so he could help with the kids in the afternoons. It wasn't something they planned, it just happened naturally. He noticed how the house changed again under her influence. The old beige curtains were replaced with light blue ones that caught the breeze. The kitchen, once cluttered with tools and unopened mail, now smelled like baked cornbread and fresh flowers. She painted Malik's new bedroom, a small corner room that had once been Ethan's storage space, a soft green. "Feels like home now," she'd said. And it did, more than he'd ever imagined it could. One evening after putting the kids to bed, Ethan stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of Tanya's laughter from the kitchen. She was on the phone, talking to someone from work, telling a story about a patient who'd called her the nice nurse with the sparkly eyes. He smiled to himself, not because of what she said, but because of how alive she sounded. Later, when she joined him on the porch, she brought 2 mugs of tea. "You ever think," she asked, "how weird it is that life can fall apart completely and somehow still rebuild itself into something better?" He took a slow sip before answering. "All the time," she smiled. "I used to think I'd lost everything. Now I think maybe I just didn't know what everything really was." The sky was deep blue, fireflies flickering across the yard. The air hummed softly around them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Tanya said, "Ethan, I don't know how to thank you. You could have driven past that night. You didn't." He looked at her, his expression steady. "You don't need to thank me. You gave this house back its heart." Her eyes softened. She wanted to say something more, but the words caught in her throat, so she just smiled instead, and he understood. Inside, the kids were asleep, the house glowing faintly through the windows. It was full again, not just of people, but of life, laughter, noise, and hope. Ethan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The sound of Tanya's quiet breathing beside him was enough to make him feel grounded, alive in a way he hadn't been for years. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The roots of warmth had settled deep in that house roots that had started the night a storm drove 2 strangers into his life. And as summer deepened, Ethan Carter realized that some storms didn't come to destroy. They came to clear the ground for new beginnings. Autumn arrived slowly, brushing the tops of the trees with gold and crimson, as if the world itself had decided to start over. The air turned crisp, the mornings cool enough for jackets, and the scent of burning leaves drifted through the streets of Louisville. For Ethan Carter, the season brought with it a quiet kind of peace he hadn't known in years. The months since Tanya had started working at the clinic had transformed their lives into something steady, something whole. The children were thriving. Lily's laughter filled the house daily, and Malik's asthma had become manageable under Tanya's careful eye. Ethan himself had begun to feel like a man waking from a long, restless sleep. He had always told himself that survival was enough, that getting through each day without breaking apart was victory enough for a widower raising a daughter alone. But now, with Tanya there, survival had quietly turned into living. The mornings felt different. There were 2 mugs on the counter instead of 1. The smell of coffee mixed with laughter instead of silence. Even the walls, once heavy with the weight of memories, seemed lighter, as though the house itself had begun to exhale. Still, under all that warmth, something unspoken began to hum between them, a low, persistent current they both felt but never named. It existed in small moments, when their hands brushed while cleaning the dishes, when they lingered too long at the table after the kids had gone to bed, when their laughter overlapped and something softer filled the silence that followed. They were careful, almost painfully so. Both knew how fragile peace could be. Tanya had learned the hard way that relying on someone else could be dangerous. She'd built her life on independence, even when that meant exhaustion and loneliness. Ethan, on the other hand, had learned that love could vanish in a heartbeat, leaving behind an emptiness that never fully healed. They were both survivors, scarred by loss in different ways, and the thought of letting anyone close enough to hurt again frightened them more than they could admit. But love, real love, rarely asks for permission. It seeps in quietly, finding cracks in the armor, taking root before anyone realizes it's there. And that's exactly what happened to Ethan and Tanya. One evening in late October, After a long day at work, Ethan came home to find Tanya in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and the soft light from the window framed her in gold. Malik and Lily were sprawled on the floor nearby, coloring together, their laughter echoing down the hallway. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching the scene unfold, the simple beauty of it, the domestic peace that once felt impossible. When Tanya turned and saw him, she smiled. "You're home earlier than usual." "Managed to finish up before the rain started," he said, hanging his jacket by the door. "Smells amazing in here." "Don't thank me yet," she laughed. "I may have overcooked the carrots." Ethan smiled, stepping closer. "Doesn't matter. Smells like home." The word slipped out before he could stop it, and they both froze. Tanya's hand tightened on the spoon she was holding, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she smiled again, softer this time. "That's the nicest thing anyone said in a long time." They ate together at the kitchen table, the four of them. The children argued over who got the last roll. Tanya teased Ethan about his hopelessly uneven haircut, and he pretended to be offended. After dinner, once the kids were in bed, Tanya began clearing the dishes while Ethan wiped the counter. The radio hummed quietly in the background. "Sit," he said finally. "I'll finish up." She shook her head. "You cooked last night. It's my turn." "Then call it even," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." Reluctantly, she sat at the table, resting her chin in her hand, watching him move around the kitchen. "You know," she said after a moment, "you don't have to do all this for us." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "Do what?" "Make it easy," she said quietly. "You already gave us a home. You didn't have to keep making space for us in your life." He set down the dish towel and turned to face her. "Tanya, it's not about having to. It's about wanting to." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and honest. Her eyes softened, but she looked away, afraid of what might come next. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it makes me forget this isn't supposed to be permanent." Ethan took a slow breath, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore." She met his gaze then, and the silence that followed said everything words couldn't. There was fear there, fear of hope, fear of loss, fear of what it might mean to want again. In the weeks that followed, that tension only deepened. They went about their routines as before, but every glance lingered a little longer. Every touch seemed charged with something unsaid. The first frost came in the early November, and with it came a sense of change neither could ignore. Then one night, Tanya fell sick. It started as a cough that grew worse over the weekend. By Monday, she was pale and weak, forced to stay home from work for the first time since she started. Ethan found her asleep on the couch when he came home, a blanket pulled up to her chin, her face flushed with fever. He knelt beside her, touching her forehead gently. She stirred, blinking groggily. "Ethan, you're home." "You should have called me," he said, his voice low but full of worry. "It's just a cold," she murmured. "I'll be fine." He shook his head. "You're burning up. You need rest." "I can't," she protested weakly. "I have to go in tomorrow. We're short-staffed and—" "Tanya," he interrupted softly but firmly, "you're not going anywhere until you're better." She sighed, eyes closing. "You sound like my mother." "Then maybe you should listen," he said. He sat with her that night, bringing her tea, checking her temperature, and tucking the blanket around her when she shivered. But what frightened him wasn't her fever. It was the feeling that came with it. Watching her so still, so vulnerable, stirred something deep and painful inside him. It reminded him too much of hospital rooms, of nights spent praying for miracles that never came. Later, after putting the kids to bed, he sat in the armchair across from the couch, unable to take his eyes off her. His hands shook slightly as he ran them over his knees. When Tanya woke and saw him sitting there, she frowned. "You've been watching me," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine, Ethan," she said, her voice gentler now. "It's just the flu." He nodded, but she could see the fear in his eyes, and the old unhealed kind. "You're scared," she said quietly. He swallowed hard. "I lost someone once. I can't—" He broke off, unable to finish. Tanya reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and took his. "I'm not her," she whispered, "and I'm not going anywhere." The tears he'd been holding back for years came without warning, hot and silent. Tanya squeezed his hand, grounding him. For a long time they stayed like that, two people carrying different kinds of grief but finding the same kind of solace. By morning, her fever had broken. The worst had passed. But something else had changed between them, something irreversible. The fear that had held them apart had begun to crumble, replaced by an understanding too deep to ignore. Over the following weeks, they learned what it meant to care for each other without losing themselves. When Tanya tried to take extra shifts at the clinic to cover expenses, Ethan argued with her for the first time. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "You're not alone in this." "I can't be dependent on you," she insisted. "I've spent my whole life taking care of things myself." "You're not dependent," he said firmly. "We're partners. That's what this is supposed to be." She wanted to argue, but the conviction in his voice silenced her. For the first time, she began to understand that strength wasn't always about standing alone. It was about knowing when to lean. The winter that followed was quiet but full. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt and exhaustion, but there was also laughter, warmth, and something that began to resemble love. Not the fragile, uncertain kind that burned too fast, but the slow, steady kind that healed. They learned each other's rhythms. Tanya teased Ethan about his habit of falling asleep on the couch. Ethan learned how she liked her tea strong, with honey. They fought sometimes, but they always made up before bed. They talked about the past, not to reopen wounds, but to understand them. And slowly the ghosts that had once haunted them began to fade. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Ethan found Tanya standing by the window, watching the flakes gather on the lawn. "You ever think about how we got here?" she asked. He stepped beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Every day." She leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so afraid, Ethan, of needing someone again, of losing everything again." He rested his chin against her hair. "Me too, but I think maybe that's what love is, being scared and choosing it anyway." She smiled faintly. "Then I guess we're doing it right." They stood there in silence, the snow still falling, the house warm and alive around them. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a man living in the aftermath of something. He felt like someone standing at the beginning. Love had found them not through grand gestures or perfect timing, but through survival, patience, and a shared understanding of pain. It had come quietly, like the first flakes of snow, soft, fragile, but enough to cover the world in light. Spring unfolded gently, as if the earth itself were waking from a long sleep. The air was softer now, carrying the smell of lilacs and rain-soaked grass, and the streets of their Louisville neighborhood were lined with new blossoms. Inside the Carter house, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. It was the kind of peace built from years of small choices, the choice to stay, to forgive, to keep going. For Ethan and Tanya, that peace was hard-earned. They had learned to live through the echoes of loss, through fear and uncertainty, and had come out the other side with something solid, something they could finally call theirs. It had been nearly 3 years since that rainy night when their lives collided. The house, once dim and heavy, now felt like a living thing, warm and humming with life. The walls carried the marks of children's laughter, a scuffed baseboard from a toy car race, a faint crayon line near the hallway that no one had bothered to scrub off. The refrigerator was covered in drawings, Lily's colorful animals, Malik's bold letters, and the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the kitchen most mornings. Ethan sometimes caught himself standing in the doorway, just looking around, unable to believe this was the same place he'd once described as a tomb. On a bright Saturday morning, the kids were in the backyard, their voices carrying through the open window. Malik was building an elaborate fortress out of cardboard boxes, while Lily bossed him around as the self-declared architect. Tanya stood by the sink, watching them with a smile, her hair pulled up in a loose bun, wearing one of Ethan's old t-shirts. She caught him looking at her from the hallway and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just wondering how I got this lucky." Tanya laughed softly. "Luck had nothing to do with it. You stopped that night." He stepped closer, touching her shoulder gently. "And you stayed." That was the truth of it. What had begun as an act of kindness had turned into the foundation of everything that followed. Over time, their lives had woven together so seamlessly that it was hard to remember where one story ended and the other began. Later that day, the four of them piled into the truck for their usual Saturday errands. The air buzzed with warmth, and the radio played old country songs that Ethan pretended not to like, but always hummed along to. Tanya teased him for it, and Lily rolled her eyes, calling them both old people. Malik sang loudly from the back seat, off-key but joyful. It was messy and loud and perfect in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. At the grocery store, they split up, Tanya and Lily heading to the produce aisle while Ethan and Malik hunted for snacks. Watching Tanya with Lily, Ethan felt that familiar, quiet awe again. She had a way of moving through the world that drew people in, calm and warm and sure. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. That evening, after dinner and a few rounds of a board game the kids had insisted on playing, Ethan tucked Lily into bed. She was half asleep when she mumbled, "Dad, are you and Tanya going to get married?" The question startled him. "What makes you ask that?" She yawned. "Because you already act like you are, and we're like a family now. I think it'd be nice if we were official." Ethan smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "You think so?" "Yeah," she said, already drifting off. "You love her, right?" He paused, his throat tightening. "Yes, sweetheart, I do." As he stood in the doorway, watching her fall asleep, the words lingered in his mind, words he'd said without hesitation for the first time in years. He did love Tanya. He loved her for the way she'd brought light back into his home, for how she'd taught him to breathe again. And as the thoughts settled, something clicked inside him, quiet but sure. The next few weeks passed quickly, the days blurring with work, school, and small routines that made up their life. Tanya's job at the clinic was steady, and Ethan's construction company had more projects than ever. On Fridays, they all gathered for movie night with popcorn and mismatched blankets. Sundays were for pancakes and lazy walks around the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. One afternoon in late May, Ethan stood in the backyard, watching the kids set up an obstacle course with pool noodles and cardboard boxes. Tanya sat on the porch steps, cheering them on, her laughter mingling with the children's shouts. Ethan reached into his pocket and felt the small velvet box hidden there. He'd carried it for days, waiting for the right moment, rehearsing a dozen ways to ask. But watching them now, Tanya's eyes crinkling as she laughed, Lily pretending to be a referee, Malik declaring himself champion of the backyard kingdom, he realized there would never be a perfect moment. There was only this. "Hey, Commander," he called, grinning. "Bring your troops over here for a second." Tanya turned, confused but smiling, and the kids came running, faces flushed from the sun. Ethan knelt down, his heart thudding. He looked at the three of them, his daughter, the boy who felt like his own, and the woman who had turned his world right side up again. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" he said. "The best team," Malik shouted, throwing his arms in the air. Ethan smiled, pulling the ring box from his pocket. Tanya's breath caught. "What if we made it official?" he said softly, looking at her. "Tanya Reed, will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Tanya's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with tears. Then she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan, 1,000 times yes." The kids erupted in cheers, Lily hugging her father while Malik jumped up and down, chanting, "We're a family! We're a family!" Tanya laughed through her tears, and Ethan pulled her into his arms, the sound of their children's joy filling the air around them. They married 6 months later, in the backyard where it had all begun. The trees were ablaze with fall color, the air crisp and clear. It was a small ceremony, just close friends, a few neighbors, and Mrs. Landers, who cried openly as she handed Tanya her bouquet. Lily walked down the aisle first, scattering petals with great seriousness, while Malik followed proudly as the ring bearer, his tiny suit slightly too big. When Tanya appeared, radiant in a simple white dress, Ethan forgot how to breathe. She wasn't just beautiful, she was whole. When it came time for vows, Ethan's voice trembled, but never faltered. "Tanya, you taught me that being broken doesn't mean being beyond repair," he said. "You showed me that it's okay to live again, to laugh again. You gave my daughter her light back and me my heart. I promise to choose you every single day, in the good times and the hard ones, because you are worth choosing." Tanya's tears fell freely as she spoke. "Ethan, you showed me that home isn't a place. It's people who love you when you have nothing left to give. You taught me that strength doesn't mean doing everything alone, and that letting someone in doesn't mean losing yourself. I promise to stand beside you, to love you with the same grace you gave me, for all the days we have." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, they kissed to the sound of laughter and applause. The children ran around them, tossing handfuls of leaves like confetti. The sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in golden rose. It was perfect, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. That night after the reception, after the music had faded and the kids had fallen asleep in the same bed, too excited to be apart, Ethan and Tanya sat on the porch together. The sky was clear, stars bright above them. The house behind them glowed softly through the windows. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Every day. I think about how easy it would have been to keep driving. How I almost did." Tanya looked down at her hands, the ring glinting in the moonlight. "I think about it too, about how I had given up that night. I was sitting in the rain with nowhere left to go, and then you stopped." He turned to her, his voice rough with emotion. "You think I saved you, but the truth is, you saved me. That house was empty before you. I was empty." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We saved each other." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet comfort of everything they had built. Through the open window, they could hear Lily's sleepy voice as she told Malik one of her bedtime stories. "And then the knight and the healer found the castle, and everyone lived happily ever after," she murmured. Tanya smiled. "Our daughter has quite the imagination." Ethan's arm tightened around her. "Our daughter," he echoed. The words settled deep, like a prayer answered too late but perfectly in time. He thought of all the years he'd spent trying to move on, not realizing what he needed wasn't to leave the past behind, but to build something new from it. Tanya had been that new beginning. Malik had been the laughter that filled the empty rooms. Together, they had turned heartbreak into a home. As the night deepened, the world outside fell silent except for the rustle of wind through the trees. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the sound of Tanya's steady breathing beside him. The rain from years ago was long gone, but in its place was something lasting, a love that had grown from the darkest storm, rooted deep and unshakable. Sometimes, Ethan thought, life didn't give you what you asked for. It gave you what you needed. He had needed to stop that night, to open his door to a stranger, to take a chance on something uncertain. Because sometimes saving someone else was exactly how you saved yourself. He looked at the house one last time before going inside, its windows glowing softly in the dark, and felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This was home, not because of walls or rooms or memories, but because of the people inside it. People who had chosen each other again and again, through fear and hope and everything in between. And as he closed the door behind them, the night wrapped around the house like a promise, one that said that sometimes the brightest beginnings are born from the heaviest rain. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, love, and second chances. Click the bell so you never miss the next chapter, and check out our other videos to keep your heart inspired. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that it's never too late to begin again, share this video with them today.